Hello, this is Pushing Boundaries, a podcast about pioneering research, breakthrough discoveries, and unconventional ideas. I'm your host, Dr. Thomas Wirny. My guest today is Dr. Nicolas Rouleau, a professor at Algoma University, Department of Psychology. He describes himself as a behavioral neuroscientist and bioengineer, fascinated by brain structure and function. His current research focuses on embodied cognition in hybrid neural robotic systems. You will have to explain this to us later. His transdisciplinary approach is motivated by a desire to understand the fundamental nature of cognitive systems. Broader implications of his work include the design of bio-inspired artificial intelligences and devices to solve the next generation of societal problems, including novel threats in security and public health. And excuse me, in 2016, you wrote a paper called "When is the Brain Dead? Living like electrophysiological responses and photon emissions from applications of neurotransmitters, oh my goodness, in fixed post-mortem human brains." But what really, I mean, that's a mouthful, right? What really caught my attention was your recent essay called what is an immortal stream of consciousness, the scientific evidence for the survival of consciousness after permanent bodily death. Have I got that right so far?
I think so. I think you're remembering it, or rather reading it, better than I remember. So, yes.
I'm afraid I'm not remembering it totally. I am reading some of it. Yes.
Okay.
Dr. Rouleau, may I call you Nicholas?
Of course, you can call me Nick.
Okay, Nick it is. So Nick, tell me about this most recent essay, which really is incredibly interesting, about the scientific evidence for the survival of consciousness after permanent bodily death. What sort of work have you done in this area?
Sure, I can tell you about it. So this essay competition was released as an international challenge a few years ago. And the idea was that everyone who has had some kind of experience at the periphery of this area of research, which is trying to figure out what happens after death, would submit a collection of ideally empirical evidence for something like experience or consciousness continuing after death. And although this isn't my main area of research, I did do my graduate studies with an individual who was very prominent in this field, who was Dr. Michael Persinger. And Dr. Persinger studied mystical experiences, out-of-body experiences, paranormal phenomena, all sorts of things like this. He was also a neuroscientist and a clinician. And so growing as an academic in that environment, I picked up a lot of really useful information about this area. And the first paper that you mentioned, the "When is the Brain Dead" paper, was sort of getting at this question of, well, we know that shortly after the brain does die, so to speak, under clinical definitions, there's still very minimal cellular activity. And the question is, when does experience actually go away? And this is very difficult to answer because we actually don't have a way to measure experience directly. We infer experience on the basis of verbal self-report, on the basis of psychometric tests, behavioral correlates, neural correlates of consciousness, things like this. But we never actually measure experience directly. So it's very difficult to actually get in under this question. And so with Dr. Persinger at the time, this was, I think, in 2016, at the time we were investigating, well, is the brain capable of anything after it has died? Can it filter signals? And this was motivated by his previous research, which was looking at how brains interact with electromagnetic fields. In fact, for over 40 years, he had studied the impact of electromagnetic fields on brain activity, as well as on the activity of other components of the body in rodents, but also in humans. And he had done a lot of research in this area, but anyone who's in the area of bioelectromagnetism will tell you that there are very few mechanistic models that exist to explain how these phenomena actually occur. We know that there is definitely an interaction between brain and electromagnetic fields. This is very clear from the literature, but it's not clear how it's happening mechanistically.
Can you define for us what is an electromagnetic field?
Oh, sure. Yeah. An electromagnetic field is a distribution of points, like any field, like a gravitational field. But in this case, it's governed by a fundamental particle called the photon. And a photon is really just light, but it also can manifest in the form of a field. And electromagnetic fields are pervasive. They're all around us. Anytime you have the movement of, anytime you have a charge, a point charge, and it moves around, you get this magnetic and electrical component of a united electromagnetic field. And they exist around you in your home when you turn on the lights, but they also, the Earth itself actually generates an electromagnetic field, about 50,000 nanotesla in intensity. And we know that organisms respond to these fields. Like the most obvious example is pigeons will home. They'll actually direct their migratory behavior on the basis of electromagnetic fields. But we also know that humans can orient in magnetic fields, and so can other animals. And we know that there are some mechanisms for this, but yeah, this is something that I'm happy to elaborate on if you want. But
so don't our brains also produce electromagnetic fields, and our heart also?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, individual cells. In fact, even more fundamental than that, individual ion channels will generate magnetic fields because there is a movement of charge across a membrane. So you can build that up, and as you move up to cells, tissues, and organs, yeah, you get more and more of these kinds of electromagnetic fields. They're most obvious in the brain and the heart because of highly excitable cells. And those are the most excitable cells in our body, but electromagnetic fields can be found all along the body. In fact, there's a prominent researcher from the early 20th century named Harold Saxton Burr, who investigated all these sorts of things, looking at how charge distributions along the body correlated with certain kinds of diseases or physiological states. And that's because fundamentally we're full of dipoles, and we're full of point charges and moving charges. And so you can actually pick these up with pretty simple devices like vacuum tube voltmeters.
So when you say that you and Dr. Prendergast, or whatever his
Dr. Persinger.
Persinger, when you and Dr. Persinger were investigating how the brain reacts to electromagnetic fields, did I get that right?
Yeah.
Electromagnetic fields were you actually talking about, since there are so many?
Good question. We were primarily interested in the geomagnetic field because it's the one that we're all immersed in all the time. In fact, it's passing through you and I right now, unless you're, I mean, I can only speak for myself, but perhaps you're in an underground bunker somewhere surrounded by mu metal.
Okay, if you are doing the experiment and you and perhaps somebody else or other people are present, it's also their electromagnetic fields that would have to be taken into consideration, would they not?
True. And this is why all of these experiments must be performed within very tightly controlled environments. So the primary shielding mechanism that we use is a Faraday cage. You can create a Faraday cage of your own, or you can purchase it, but it's basically just a material that surrounds the body or whatever you're studying. If you study cells, it could be a little cage, and it's grounded such that any kind of electromagnetic activity from the outside or inside can't pass through that membrane.
Great. Okay, please continue. Yes.
So in any case, we were studying this because we wanted to understand if the brain could have any kind of interaction with electromagnetic fields after death that would enable some kind of function to emerge that would remotely approximate something like the correlates that you see associated with consciousness. So if I have a person come into the lab and I actually measure their brain waves, I can look for signatures that they are conscious or not. And actually I can determine whether that person is sleeping and in fact what stage of sleep that they're in based upon their brain waves, because we have a robust literature of neural correlates of consciousness. So the question is, can you see any of these types of correlates in deceased tissues when exposed to certain kinds of patterns of electromagnetic fields? And this would open the possibility to having basically this second modality associated with brain activity. So the primary one is the one you might find in a textbook, one of the ones that you might find behind me, which is the sort of active brain where you have cells and cells are generating small amounts of current, and that current is driving everything that we know, our experience, our behaviors. And it's a really active process, requires a lot of energy, and it's internally generated, it's productive. But there's this other modality that was originally proposed by the great William James, who was one of the first psychologists, as you know, and was a great thinker and philosopher. And the idea was that perhaps there's another modality called transmissive consciousness. And the idea would be that there's some force outside of the brain that interacts with the brain, and the brain filters that force. And from it, we get consciousness, we get experience, we get whatever the brain does. And we were simply investigating whether deceased brain tissues, devoid of that first modality, we get rid of anything active that could be happening. Is there anything left in there that could explain some of the phenomena that we see and some of the neural correlates of consciousness that we see in living people? And we did. We found all sorts of interesting signatures, which is if you have a deceased, so if you have brain specimens that have been fixed in a chemical preservative for many years, and you place these inside of basically a coil, and you run current through this coil to generate a magnetic field, and then you measure microvolt fluctuations in the tissues themselves when this field is being generated, you'll notice that certain areas of the brain filter that field differently than others. And in fact, the areas that filter those fields in a way that's most congruent with the types of oscillations that you see in humans are areas in the deep temporal lobe, which incidentally are the major areas that are most susceptible in vivo, in living, breathing human beings, when we're talking about electromagnetic brain interactions. So there's an interesting sort of mechanism in the absence of life that was occurring here. And we thought it was interesting. We published a number of papers on it. And this was the foundation for much of the contribution to that essay that I was originally talking about.
So are you saying that some of these brains that have been preserved in chemicals for God knows how long, right, still demonstrate some life?
It really depends on what you consider life to be. Yeah.
What do you consider life to be?
Well, I think when we refer to life colloquially, we're usually talking about something like an experienced life. We're usually talking about, waking up, suddenly opening your eyes and experiencing a world around you, and then being able to close your eyes at night and that experience going away. And that's life. And when you're no longer able to do that, then you're no longer living. And we consider that to be a person who's died. But I think that the word that we use for life is actually highly loaded. There's lots of things that we're describing when we're describing life. Of course, biologists will describe life in terms of self-replication capabilities. And we can talk about life in terms of experience. I think that's a great way to talk about life. But it's unclear. If you're asking me personally whether I think that a brain in a jar with chemical preservatives can experience a world, which I think is the more interesting question, I I don't know, but I would say probably not. What we see instead are signatures of a capacity for experience that is preserved when you preserve the structure. So it's like if I take my laptop or my computer and I unplug the power and then the reserve power runs out, there's still an internal circuitry that has a capacity for experience, but it's simply unable to generate that experience because there's no internal power source. You may actually be able to induce power using an external power source. You could create flashes of the computer working, but a sustained, continuous stream-like experience would not be possible until you satisfied certain kinds of conditions. Yeah.
Well, that can take us in many different directions. I'm thinking, I mean, this may be a totally crazy question, but I'm thinking of two psychics that I have met in my life. And I don't know whether you've had any experiences with psychics or not, but these two women that I have actually met were incredibly accurate in terms of telling you about, not me, but also other people, not just myself, like some of my patients, incredible things, you know, like I see your father and his right leg is kind of, oh, there's something wrong with his right leg. He's sort of dragging it behind him. I mean, how can anybody know that? And she was right on. So in terms of what you were just saying to me, I'm thinking, well, perhaps, you know, part of us never really dies.
It's possible, but I have an alternative interpretation. So first of all, this is an area of research where there are people who are dedicated to actually studying this, and I'm definitely not one of these people. So I am probably ignorant about a lot of the research in this area. But I would say that when I was working in Dr. Persinger's lab, we did have a prominent person with abilities like this come in, who we measured their brain activity when they were reading individuals and performing these kinds of extrasensory ability tasks. And we noticed that the electromagnetic fields around their temporal lobes would change as they were reading someone, but the target person's temporal lobes were also changing. And also, we had photomultiplier tubes in the room, which detect light emissions, and the brain emits light. All tissues emit light, small amounts of light. And the light emissions actually correlated between the individual who was reading and the target. And so there may actually be a fundamental connection between the person who's reading and the target individual that is occurring at the level of the brain. So suppose there is no afterlife. I don't know if there is or not, but suppose there wasn't. How do you explain this phenomenon? Well, so what often happens when you encounter a psychic individual, someone who claims to have these abilities, they'll tell you something really striking that you know. And the classical sort of skeptic interpretation is that some sort of cold reading technique. Well, suppose that they're actually extracting information from you in this way, in a way that maybe they're not even aware how they're doing it. But they are extracting information and then feeding it back to you. And that would be incredibly illuminating and maybe even therapeutic for some individuals. Maybe they just need to know that their deceased loved one exists in a place outside of them, even if they don't actually exist outside of them, and they haven't survived death. It would still be therapeutic to the individual to think they did. But I'm not sure, of course, that this is very difficult to determine with any kind of certainty, right?
Yes. All right, let's get back to something that you're comfortable with. So how do you think this type of research will benefit humanity? The research.
I'm not sure that it will. My general approach to science and research is that you should do it for its own sake. A lot of scientists will get into science in order to help people, usually in a sort of direct way, trying to understand disease processes and things like this. I'm interested in basic phenomenon. I'm interested in how the universe works, how the brain works more specifically. And I don't really know if it's going to help anybody, but I think there are plenty of examples throughout history of mathematics. Mathematics is probably the most prominent field associated with this, where some discovery is made. It's not sure what, well, we're not really sure whether it's going to be useful, and then it changes the world. And so my motivation really is just to understand how things work, and the engineers and other more practical scientists can take this information and turn it into devices and technologies and things like this.
No, I totally understand that. Do you think there was anything in your own background that contributed to your interest in this subject?
It's a good question. Well, I was raised Catholic, but I'm not really a religious individual. So from a young age, I did have, sort of thoughts of an afterlife. At least a model was instilled in me about what an afterlife could look like potentially. And so people were talking about this sort of thing. But I really hadn't thought of it seriously until I entered university and was starting to think about it in a more academic sense. So it wasn't really motivated on a personal level. I've always just really had an interest in trying to understand how the universe works, how the brain works. And so when I came across Dr. Persinger's research, it so happened that he was actually working in the place where I grew up. So when I joined his lab, I was really fascinated by this idea and trying to understand it empirically, because I know that there's a lot of people who will try to study these phenomena in a kind of way where they're trying to justify their own beliefs. But I really I sort of take a dispassionate approach. It really doesn't matter to me whether one reality is true or the other. I just want to know how it really works. So I don't think it really was motivated by a personal experience or anything like that.
So what is more important to you, how the brain works or how the universe works?
To me, I think that how the brain works is more important. It's really it's the gateway that we have to everything else, and it's the only thing that we can be sure of in terms of an actual object that has a function that we can directly feel and experience. I'm not sure that anything else outside of the brain or experience itself exists. I assume that it does for practical purposes, but I think that understanding the brain is probably one of the most important scientific questions. So
what is it that you're working on right now? What is foremost in your on your desk?
Oh, sure. So the thing I'm interested in is I'm interested in knowing how I want to know whether neurons and glial cells and other types of specific substrates that you find in brains are necessary to create brains. I want to know whether brain, the category of brain, is actually a very, very wide-ranging category that we currently assume is only found in living organisms and is only structured in a certain way. Because I suspect that, in fact, there are many thinking systems in our universe and on our planet that we don't currently acknowledge as being cognitive, and yet they display all of the features of cognition, or at least some of the features of cognition, and would therefore merit some kind of classification like a proto-consciousness, proto-cognition, a minimal cognition, something like this. And I think it has to do with sensory motor loops, or at least some kind of affective, effective loop process where data is coming in and action is going out. I think systems that have this basic structure, this sort of sensory motor loop, are able to really demonstrate the most fundamental capacities that we term and value as cognition. So that's what I'm really interested in. The way that I'm trying to understand this is by creating artificial miniaturized brain tissues like organoids and spheroids and scaffold-based neural constructs in the whole area of nervous system modeling, and take these miniaturized tissues and give them tasks. See if they can actually solve problems. See if they can process information in unique ways. And the benefit of this is that we can actually manipulate it systematically. So with a rat brain or a human brain, you can't go in and take all the wires and switch them positions and things like this. You can do a little bit of that with genetic knockouts, and you can damage an area or stimulate a particular area, sure. And we've been doing that for 100 years, but you really can't rewire the thing. What you really need to understand how brains work at the most fundamental level is the ability to systematically control all the variables in a sort of minimal state. So I want precisely this many cells connected in this way. Or I want to see if, instead of having a 6-layered neocortex like you and I have, I want to see what would happen if there were 3 layers or 8 layers or 100 layers. Would that change the circuitry? Would it change the way that the cells communicate with each other? And by understanding how that works, we get closer to the fundamental question, which is, what is cognition? What is the essence of cognition? So that's really what I'm interested in.
So I believe you are married to Professor Nirosha Murugan.
Yeah, I am.
And she has done research on molds and unicellular organisms that have no brains at all. Correct? So
yes,
you get into some interesting discussions with her about brains.
Some of the time. We try to keep personal and professional a little bit separated, so that we don't completely exhaust ourselves.
Yes.
But yeah, we will definitely have conversations about this. She's a great scientist, and some of her work has demonstrated that you really can have kind of thinking, problem-solving, decision-making system that doesn't have a brain at all. And there are plenty of examples with not just molds, but also amoeba and other kinds of organisms where really the patterns that define our cognition are there, but we just call them something else because there's a kind of anthropocentric model of what cognition is currently.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. So in terms of your own life, what is your most vivid childhood memory?
My most vivid childhood memory.
One that really stands out in your childhood. You look back on your childhood and you say, yes, that's the one.
It's a good question.
Take your time. No rush.
I have a lot of great experiences. I didn't have a bad childhood. A lot of people have had sort of mixed or troublesome childhoods. I think I had a good childhood, and so nothing really pops out directly.
Okay, so just tell me about a few that were really great.
I had an experience once. It was for a birthday, where my parents had created a sort of spider web in the basement of yarn. And the yarn had gone from one corner to the other and created this network. And it was it was in the basement. So when I went there, the idea was that you had to like untangle these wires, or you had to untangle the yarn.
What was the point of that?
The point was not only to entertain children for a birthday party, but also it was a kind of game where if you untangled the yarn, you would eventually get some sort of like a little treat bag at the end. And so you would do this with your friends. And the idea was that you'd be like stepping over one or going underneath another. It is sort of interactive thing. And I just remember the experience of sort of showing up and seeing it and thinking, wow, this is really different. And it sort of married my fascination with complex things, but also with problem solving. I've always loved the idea of solving puzzles and things like this. But then again, I question whether that was really what was interesting to me, because I do wonder whether I'm retrospectively inserting a narrative here. but it does stick out to me as sort of being a kind of fascinating childhood experience.
Yeah. What does your father do?
My father's worked a number of jobs. Very hardworking person. So he is currently, he works in a hospital where he takes care of sort of making sure that ORs and other rooms are sanitized, and making sure that everything is not going to cause post-operative infections and things like this. And my mother, well, she's for many years she worked as a childcare worker, and that was fascinating too, because I got to see children sort of develop cognitively over many years. It was really fascinating to see language emerge and things like this, even from a young age, to see that sort of process of growth. So yeah, sort of.
So they are not scientists. They're not academics like you.
No, actually, very few people in my family. I may have a cousin or two, but I'm sort of the black sheep in my family.
Black sheep. You should be the white sheep. Do your parents understand your work?
Yeah, I think they do. I'm not sure a lot of people understand it. I think people in the field understand it, sure. But I think that the idea that other organisms, including plants and single cells and things like this, have a kind of prototypical cognition, I think that is misunderstood on a very wide level. But when I explain this to my parents, for example, they think it's conceivable. In fact, I think if you asked most non-scientists whether it would be possible, most people would say that, yeah, sure, why not? I think my plants, for example, that I take care of respond to me or know that I'm present and things like this. A lot of people have these sort of animistic beliefs. In fact, it's a feature of childhood development, animistic beliefs, and whether those are preserved later on in life, I think that's an individual thing, but sure.
Right. Well, what about your colleagues? Have you run up against some disapproval, some criticism in your work?
Nothing too vitriolic. I've surrounded myself with a lot of very supportive individuals, and in fact, in recent years, with primarily biological engineers. And I found that bioengineers are very open-minded people. On the other hand, unfortunately, in the biological sciences, I think in particular in molecular sciences, you have a tendency to think that substrates, specific pathways, specific proteins, specific types of cells are intrinsically important. Like, in other words, the functions of a neuron are neuron specific. And I think that that's demonstrably false. And yet there's a kind of reverence for these very specific substrates. And that makes sense. It's their field of study. But biological engineers and physicists, more so on the engineering side, they're a lot more interested in fundamental principles and substrate independence, like whether you can recapitulate a certain kind of function in another substrate, right? Whether you can create an artificial intelligence that is, for all practical purposes, a brain, but without the meat. And so I've surrounded myself largely with biological engineers, and that's sort of the community that I'm in. And I get a lot of support from them.
So there have been no sort of traumatic incidents where you would present a paper and somebody stood up and said, "This is BS."
A lot more with the post-mortem brain stuff. Yeah, I've had like.
You remember one?
Yes, I have a particular experience with a prickly academic who was the chair of a department, very prominent person actually, And I was applying for a job, and this person, this individual was pretending that they wanted to know more about the subject, but in fact they were sort of implicitly teasing something like this. And I sort of addressed it in good faith, saying, here are the empirical reasons why you should think that this is at least something to look at. I'm not saying that it's the end all be all, but it's something to take seriously. And it was basically at that point I was just not responded to. So, but it comes with the territory. I should say that I like to criticize too, and I can be a little bit pointed. So I don't mind if I get it too.
Did you study with Mike Levin like your wife did?
Yeah, I did.
You did.
Yeah. So my primary supervisor in my postdoc was Dr. David Kaplan, very prominent bioengineer who is incredibly supportive individual. And I was also working with Dr. Michael Levin, and together we had formed a subgroup within what was the Allen Discovery Center at the time, the new Allen Discovery Center at Tufts University. And the idea was that we would try to understand these sort of minimal cognitive states. And I was actually brought on specifically because I wasn't the typical engineer or the typical biology PhD. And I could actually, with an open mind, come to try to build a cognitive system using these tissue engineering principles.
So when you say you were not a typical engineer, what do you mean by that?
Well, I should say that I'm not an engineer at all. My PhD is in biomolecular sciences, and my specialty and my expertise is really in neuroscience. But I gained a lot of experience in biological engineering. And so I consider myself to be a bioengineer at this point. But at that point, I was really just a sort of neuroscientist who had worked on sort of strange ideas and was relatively open-minded and willing to learn new skills in order to apply those sort of strange ideas in practical ways.
So is Algoma University a very supportive place for you? Do you feel fully supported in your research there?
I've had lots of support at Algoma University, and I've been working here for a couple of years now, and the idea is that I'm going to build a research program around a new grant that I just won at the federal level. I was awarded a grant to study this embodied cognition phenomenon using neurorobotic systems. And yeah, I've had lots of support, no sort of strange critiques or underhanded comments about the field at all. I've only had supportive comments about research.
Are you thinking of writing a book about your research?
I've just written a book chapter about this, and that's quite enough. I mean, the essay that we started the conversation with was quite long, and so was the book chapter. And I've just finished writing a very long review paper for a prominent journal, and I think I'm going to take a little bit of a break from writing. I really enjoy writing, but writing is taxing, not just physically. What's that?
Tell me about it.
Yeah, it's very taxing. And so being in your head constantly, and as you know, when you're writing, you're really talking to yourself. And so spending months at a time talking to yourself, I think is not the healthiest thing that you can do. And so I have to take a little bit of a break from that. But I would absolutely love to write a book at some point.
Well, I think you should, because it's a really interesting subject. And I think you're one of the few people who is doing research in this particular area. So I think that would be great. My book that I just published last year took me 7 years to write.
My goodness.
500 references are actually in the book. And in preparation for it, I read about 5,000 papers and books.
Unbelievable.
So I know about how hard it is. I know what it's like. So tell me, what's important in your life? What do you consider really, really important to you as a person?
Number one, I would say that personal relationships are extremely important. All of this is relatively meaningless unless you have people to share it with. My wife and my child are number one to me. I would absolutely give up science for them. I love science. I love solving puzzles. But if you don't have people, it's really not worth it. And this extends to science itself. If you're doing science and you can't bring on great students and great staff, you won't go anywhere. You really need people in this world. And so I find that the most important thing to me really is others. Then I would say meaningful experiences, trying to figure out for ourselves what we should be doing with our own time. I think that's a really important journey. And then I would say something like solving problems and helping others and so on. And you know, if you asked me this several years ago, if you asked me this like maybe 10 years ago or 5 years ago even, I probably would give you the total opposite answer. This is a recent revelation. Yeah, in the past couple of years, starting a family and you know, being in isolation with the rest of the world and things like this, I think it's quite clear that the most important thing is really spending your time with others.
I agree. I totally agree. Well, I think on that note, perhaps we should pause. I want to thank you, Nicolas, for joining us. It's been amazing, fascinating, truly. I just really enjoyed talking to you. I wish you success in your in all the work that you have undertaken. I think it's important. I think it's interesting. I will follow it from afar, not that far. How many miles from Stratford to Sault Ste. Marie?
Oh, goodness. It's probably, well, let's see. It's probably 600 kilometers or something like that, 700.
Yeah. Well, perhaps one of these days we'll meet.
Perhaps. I look forward to it.
Me too. So my guest next week will be Dr. Paul Valent, a psychiatrist from Melbourne, Australia, with whom I will be discussing his psychotherapy experiences treating children of Holocaust survivors. So something very different, and hope you can tune in and listen to that. And Nicolas, once again, thank you for being here, and thank you for all your research, which I think is really important. Goodbye.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.